welcome to Tea and Strumpets, a Regency romance review. I'm Zoe.
And I'm Kelsey.
So we've got a big announcement for you listeners.
Yes, we are excited to tell you all that Tea and Strumpets is now part of the brand new Frolic podcast network.
And if you're not familiar with Frolic already, Frolic is a website and a brand that brings together a community of diverse voices that include authors, fans, bookstagrammers, and storytellers to deliver feel-good content and commerce to the voracious consumer who enjoys escaping into a great love story. In other words, people like us.
So the Frolic Podcast Network has launched with 13 romance-centric podcasts covering the range of topics and genres for romance fans and everyone who loves a happily ever after. Podcasts like Smart Podcast, Trashy Books, Big Gay Fiction Podcast, Learning the Tropes, Us, and many more.
So what does that mean for you, our listeners? Logistically, nothing. You can still get our podcast wherever you get it today, and it will still be produced exactly as you know and have come to love. But it does mean more shows for you to enjoy and more opportunities for us to introduce you to awesome new podcasts you'll love.
And for us, being in the network enables us to do what we do and do it better. So huzzah! You can learn more and see all the great shows at frolic.media/podcasts.
You'll be hearing more from us about the network and the other shows in the future, but for now, we have another special treat for you today. It's our first interview.
We had such a fantastic conversation. We hope you all love it as much as we did.
So as there's a lot in there, we're going to get right into it, and we'll see you all in the parlor afterwards for a bit of a wrap-up.
All right, let's get into our interview with best-selling author Maya Rodale. So today, we're joined by best-selling author of more than a dozen books that include nonfiction, contemporary, and historical romance, Maya Rodale. Yay!
Hi.
Hi, Maya.
Thank you for joining us today, Maya.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and Maya, you do a lot of other things too, I have found out. You teach writing workshops, you're a speaker, you write for NPR Books, and you guest on podcasts.
Yes, I keep busy. To me, I love writing the books, but the story of romance, I think, goes beyond the book.
I completely agree as someone who is doing a romance podcast. But before we get further into what we're talking about today, I have our first really tough question for you, which is, what is your favorite romance novel?
Oh my God.
We like to start off with a bang here.
That's impossible.
Oh, good. I'm not the only one. I say a true mark of a book lover is someone who literally couldn't tell you what their favorite book is because there's so many wonderful books out there.
Yeah. There's so many wonderful ones out there. I've read so many.
If you had to take one to a desert island, what would that book be?
Oh my God. Let me put it this way. Let me answer your question this way. One of the things I love about romance is that there's something for every mood you find yourself in.
Absolutely.
And so, I don't know what the book is for Stranded on a Desert Island. I can't think of it right now, but I can tell you I've been in a mood and period in my life recently where I'm like, I need a Tessa Dare novel.
Yeah.
Only a Tessa Dare novel will do.
Mm-hmm.
I need something light and funny and sweet, and that's all I can handle.
That is right where I'm at right now. The last book that I just read for fun was a Tessa Dare novel. In fact, the last two. Yeah. Really cool. So everyone that's listening might know you from the things that we just discussed, but today we're talking about something a little bit different from that. We're talking about your book, Dangerous Books for Girls, The Bad Reputation of Romance Novels Explained.
Yes.
So we have a lot to talk about with this book, but I thought it might be nice to give you, Maya, a little backstory about how I stumbled upon it. So I actually wanted to create a deck for our podcast to send out to networks and to advertisers to like form some partnerships or try some things because like we're a new endeavor and we don't have like the gazillions of numbers yet because we're just starting out to entice them that way. So I wanted to find stats about romance novels and the romance industry. And my mission was just completely abandoned because I found your infographics and your statistics. And I just like immediately was like, move over deck. This isn't important. I want to learn more about this whole thing because as I started reading, the website about dangerous books for girls and all of the stuff that you had on there, I was just like, yes, like this is everything that I've been thinking, but having a hard time putting into words.
Aww.
Yes. And then she sent me a text message and she's like, Kelsey, look at this. And I was like, okay, I'm here.
And like, so a podcast is like a very public forum, right? Like you're putting yourself completely out there and you're saying, these are my views and this is what I'm saying. And what comes out of your mouth that day, maybe isn't the best thing. Thank goodness for editing. But I actually really I was really excited about the idea that I had with this podcast, but I kind of struggled for a while to actually go through with it and bring the idea up to Kelsey because I was actually contemplating a career move into politics. And I thought, do I want to be saying all these things about romance novels and then be in politics? And then I found out that Stacey Abrams is published romance novels. And I was like, screw this, I'm going for it,
Great.
Yeah. So I just feel like Kelsey and I are both still in the beginning of our journey kind of with talking about romance novels eloquently. And this book is such a great resource for people like us who are learning and agreeing with everything in it, but learning how to have these public conversations.
Thank you. Yes. When do I vote for you? Where do I vote for you? We need more romance people in politics. And thank you. You've really gotten to the heart of why I wrote this book. And in a sense, it started as an angry blog comment because there was a time when you would see all these snarky blogs about romance and we would all get on there and be like, no, you're wrong, blah, 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 blah. I'm tired of typing this out and losing a day. I'm just going to write the damn book that sums up why this is a wonderful, powerful genre and space for women and people who identify as women and who are aligned with women. There's a lot happening in romance. It's not just a fluffy paperback novel. And so with Dangerous Books for Girls, I wanted to talk about what was happening and why we always have all these feelings and why we should feel really damn good about this genre and this space.
Absolutely. And I think that, as Zoe said, we're still learning to really push ourselves and be out there with our love of romance. And I've never hidden from it, when they're like, oh, what type of books do you read? It's I love romance novels. But I feel like every time I said that, it was I was geared towards a fight. I was geared towards the defensive. I'm going to tell you I like romance. And then I'm just going to immediately say why it's a good genre and why you shouldn't naysay it, even before they have naysayed it, because that was kind of just the reaction and the perception versus I know doing this podcast, I've kind of just thrown it off and I'm just listen to my podcast. It's about romance novels. I don't care what you think about it. Listen to it.
Right. But that's a progression I think a lot of us go through in romance is, I mean, for me, I resisted reading them in the first place because I thought I was better than that. Mm-hmm. Look at me now. But, then I got into it and then it was you are always prepared to justify it, which is absurd because no one expects that of mystery.
Yeah.
It's such a loaded thing.
And you say that later on in the book, there's a section about how if we spend the first quarter of everything justifying, where does that leave us? If we didn't do that and we had 100% of the talk on all of the good things, how much further would we get? And I thought that was
thank you,
mind blowing. I don't know if practically in every conversation I can always do that just because sometimes, depending on where the person is that you're talking to, but I'm definitely striving towards that. But I'm totally jumping ahead here.
Well, I want to add to that though. I think I think Romanclandia as a whole is getting there, where we don't start at every blog like justifying our existence. And little by little that will like just seep out and seep down and work for all of us, that we can just start talking about, I love these books, here's why, and no excuses necessary.
Yes, absolutely. But, you know, in talking about the book, like, can you outline for our listeners who maybe haven't read the book, you talk about why romance novels are dangerous. So
I call the book Dangerous Books for Girls because I think romance as a genre is dangerous in that it is tremendously empowering to women because it gives us a vision of how we want our lives to be. It gives us experience being agents of change and authors of our own destiny. It brings us into the marketplace in like real ways as, you know, creators of something, buyers, sellers. And it's a space where women can talk amongst themselves, kind of unmediated by any men or status quo or like whatever mainstream media, for lack of a better term. So it's a space where like women can come together and talk about their hopes and dreams and get experience changing things on the page. And I think that translates to women changing how they think about themselves or how they live their lives in real life.
I can attest to that. I came to romance novels pretty late in my life, and
you're welcome.
And all of a sudden, I really was just like, oh, wait a minute. Like, this doesn't have to be this way, or I don't have to think about this way. And I've always been a happily ever after fairy tale sort of girl, but romance novels were such a more relatable thing for as an adult, you know, seeing other adult women have, you know, successful and happy and rewarding adult relationships. It was definitely eye-opening and wonderful.
And that for me is, I think, really what I was explaining, like when I was introducing her to them, I was like, you need to read the ones with like the strong female characters. Cause that for me, I've always loved, like, I love strong heroines, you know, that match the heroes, you know, that's what I love about them. I want a sassy girl who doesn't care, you know, who just sets off to live her life. Like, I love that. And those are my favorite books for sure.
Right. I love those as well. My favorite thing is the banter between the two people who won't stand out with each other. Like, then it gets really fun and engaging, and before you know it, you're sucked into the story and living along with them.
So there were a few facts in your book that I'd love to highlight because I couldn't get past this. The first was the taxes on knowledge. I think I've read that, you know, in history or whatever, but like the window tax, the fact that, you know,
I did know that one for some weird reason. I did know about the window tax. I don't know why, but I did.
So windows were taxed. So people had less windows. So the less fortunate couldn't afford windows. So they couldn't read as much because there wasn't enough natural light. And that wasn't repealed till I think 100 years after it was put into effect. And I was just like, okay, what is going on with the world? We have been terrible since the beginning.
Yeah. That's one thing you learn as a historian is like, everything's bad all the time. We have everything happening now has already happened. Yeah. So I read this article on the New York Times recently on like print books making a comeback, in that, especially in all these authoritarian regimes taking over the world, because you can't track them the way you can a Google search. You can't leave this trail of who's been reading what revolutionary text. You can just smuggle them. You can't, they're harder to censor. And you can, read it by candlelight. You can read it outside. You can just slip it to your friend and neighbor with the groceries. Like the print novel is like actually coming back as a really subversive way to carry ideas through authoritarian regimes. And so you see, it's kind of the same thing as with these taxes on knowledge, because what is the novel? It is a vision of the world changing. And if you're in power, you don't want people to see that vision. And you especially don't want like women or poor people, or I would include now people of color, getting to say what the world should look like. So yeah, you were going to try to stop that. And I do want to take a moment, but I wrote Dangerous Books for Girls, I think in 2015. So it was pre-Me Too and like right on the cusp of all these conversations about inclusivity and diversity in Romanclandia. And so I don't touch on those subjects because I wasn't aware of them. They just weren't up in the space that I was existing in yet. So if I were to rewrite the book today, I would be much more inclusive and factor that in. But I think it all tells the same story that Dangerous Books for Girls does tell.
I completely agree. And because I was thinking of that, and we had that kind of as a question we definitely wanted to bring up, which is that it's been 4 years, which isn't a long time, but also the last 4 years have been
so much has happened. It's insane. The collective world consciousness has really changed its view and perception. And there is a lot of, radical social change, to put it that way. So
they say, so I'm brainwashed a little by the CEO of the company I'm in, but we're in the fourth industrial revolution, which is the digital revolution. But what we're going to do in the next 50 years is the advancement is way more advancement than what we've done in the last 300 years. And even if maybe that's referring to technology, it's still extremely relevant in this context too, in just the social kind of change that we're going to see in response to that. Yeah. I mean, it's very different out there right now than it was even 4 years ago. And so do you feel like anything's improved for the romance novel since then? Do you think that we're still talking about it the same way? What do you think is the difference?
I think a lot has changed in Romanclandia since Dangerous Books for Girls came out. Either, I'm not going to say because of it, but it was part of a trend happening. So talking about romance as a feminist space, I think that's pretty accepted. We've made that argument. We're yes, moving on. We're not justifying it anymore on those terms. We're not having that conversation anymore. And I was speaking with one of my romance friends, and she's like, now it's about intersectionality. And how does that show up in romance, in both the books, in publishing, in the marketplace around romance? And I think that's our next big conversation that Romanclandia should be having, and I think we are having it. But I think that's the next iteration.
And one of the things that you talk about in the book is kind of the evolution of romance novels too, how we kind of, started in the 70s with, a lot of the kind of more forceful.
The Flame and the Flower, yeah.
Yeah. We actually had a listener who recommended, she's like, I'd really love for you guys to read that one. So maybe we will one day, but we've both never read it.
It's really worth reading, I think. It's hard. I've gone back and reread it. It's hard, but it also got me in the genre because I was like, how are these people going to end up happy together? And I don't think it rings true in the same way it might have done, but it's very interesting to see where we've come from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that that's really the way that you describe that though, is that, it's kind of a little bit with, if I can say, with respect to where we've come from, right? Which is that we don't have to necessarily hate the things that were in the 70s, because those were stepping stones to where we are now, and how kind of, I don't know if you can speak a little bit about how the romance novels and the rape culture of the 70s, not culture, but the rape that was kind of seen in the 70s was more of a way for a woman to explore her sexuality in a different kind of space.
Yeah. So I wasn't born yet. I wasn't there. But from everything I've read and people I've talked to, is that the bodice ripper was the way we started having this conversation about women's sexuality, and that a woman wasn't allowed to own her own desires or have sex out of choice or proactively. And so this was the way they got sex on the page and got it. It was part of the story, part of a woman's transformation as a character, part of her emotional journey. And is it problematic today? Absolutely. Should we still look at it and discuss it? Like, yeah, maybe. So I think it's interesting to consider in light of the culture it was written in and the time and what it did in order to invent this genre and move it forward. But I'm glad we've moved on and moved past it. And I think one of the powers of romance is that because we write it so quickly, relatively to a literary fiction work, for example, because it is so quick, it is so in conversation with the culture. And so anytime you look at a romance novel, you can see what was kind of happening in the world at the time and how we viewed women, how we viewed men, how we viewed simple interactions between them. And it's a snapshot of the time. And I think it's worth looking at and seeing and understanding and appreciating, but then knowing you have the freedom to not replicate that. For example, I'm reading a Tessa Dare novel. It's a duke and a governess.
Mm-hmm. Gee, I wonder.
It's like, I'm like, oh, Tessa, I'm really doing this like in this day and age. And it's like, how do you take those power dynamics and make it okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so Tessa Dare's very recently written Duke and Governess novel is not the Duke and Governess novel I started reading in romance 15 years ago. It's much more aware of power dynamics. It puts much more agency on the woman to drive the relationship forward. And so this is what I mean by it. It's interesting to see how we think about ourselves has changed by looking at the romances we've written and loved.
Yeah, no, for sure. And having read some older novels, like I've read a nice 70s, 80s bodice ripper and was like, oh, what am I reading right now? And then, but then, like you said, even just like you can see the progression, having been reading them now for about 10 years, like I can see the progression, as you say, the power dynamics. Now it's very much focused on the females driving the relationship. And like they also really highlight the inequalities women faced 100 years ago, 150 years ago that we're still really working towards today. I know that, my grandmother, was it my great grandmother, one of them, but they had to leave their job because they got pregnant. Mm-hmm. And like that was in the 20th century. And so it's just very interesting.
Was your grandmother Elizabeth Warren?
No, I think
I
know. Right? I wish. No, but it's just very interesting to talk about that. And I will say that for me, reading romance novels actually does highlight the inequalities between the genders and how they've really been prevalent. So for you as an author, you want to be historical, but still keep it modern and up to date. So right. What are those challenges for you? And how do you think the genre is really working towards all that and making it modern while still keeping those historical aspects true to form? Right.
So speaking specifically about historical romance, oh my God, I have so much to say on this. I don't even know where to begin. I think for a long time in Romanclandia, historical romance functioned as a way for us to negotiate these very patriarchal power structures in a escapist fantasy kind of way. And I think we're like really starting to look at like what is happening in a historical romance and starting to look harder at what we're romanticizing and how we romanticize it. And so I want to take a minute to clarify. There's actually historical accurate, and then there's the idea of historical accuracy in romance. Yeah. So these two are not the same.
For sure.
And so, I once said like, oh, well, if you want to write historical romance, you don't really need to do a lot of historical research. Just read more historical romance. And I'm sorry, and to my everlasting shame, I have said that. But what I was getting at is that the historical romance readers seem to want is this fluffy Regency where we don't talk about where the Duke's money came from. We don't talk about the fact that he could rape her and she had no recourse. He could take her children. And what was she going to do? Nothing. And they're very whitewashed and they're very heteronormative. Like But I think what's happening in romance now is that we're saying, like, wait a minute, this was not actually historically accurate. We're looking at the real history with a broader perspective. And now how can we start to include that? And so, you see more gay love stories. You see more people of color in historical romance. And you see a widening lens of how we look at all of these things and reckon with them. And I think that's wonderful. And that's including that point of view and like allowing the contemporary gaze to look at the history is why historical romance is always fresh and interesting. It also gets dated, but like that's how we keep reinventing the genre, is by including more modern perspectives. That's a topic where like I want to write a whole chapter and a whole new version of Dangerous Books for Girls on like what's happening with historical accuracy and even white supremacy in historical romance. So if that was not...
Write your addendum. Just stick it on the internet. There you go.
So what I wanted to talk about next was kind of the history of the romance novel and how it got its cheap reputation. And one thing that I thought was unbelievably fascinating. Now this is, you start talking about the romance novel from the beginning, like from hundreds of years ago, but where I thought it was like totally fascinating. I mean, I thought most of it was how you wrote about in the 70s, Harlequin built their business and readership by giving free romance novels in Kotex boxes, Ajax cleanser, laundry detergent, and cosmetics, and at McDonald's one Mother's Day. And then you write, with these tactics, they built their brand and also associated romance with things that are shameful, dirty, need to be covered up, or cheap or unhealthy junk food. Oh my God. Like, what?
So I forget what the book is called that I learned that in. It's in the footnotes for Dangerous Books for Girls. But yeah, the history of Harlequin is fascinating, and they really exploded romance. They did so much to explode romance, but the way they did it also like brought these negative connotations alongside with it. And to be fair, women's fiction was never considered respectable or serious. It was never taken seriously. And I think so that's not Harlequin's fault. But I think because it was never taken seriously, you could be like, hey, let's sell it with McDonald's and tampons. Like, you would never do that to a like Jonathan Franzen novel, but maybe we should. So it's interesting the associations that were built in to romance. Similarly, it's sold in grocery stores. So women could slip it in with a grocery budget. It's sold at drugstores and airports, just on the go impulse purchases where it's, it doesn't require a lot of thought. We're not laboring over this decision. And because of we're not laboring over it, it's like, oh, it's just an easy throwaway matter. Nothing consequential here. So all these things are implied in how these books were marketed and where they were sold and how they were purchased. But, talking to you guys, talking to any reader, these books aren't devalued to us at all.
Yeah, to the romance community, we don't feel that way at all. I actually just feel like I'm getting a good deal when I can get a book for, for a low price or whatever. And now I run to the kiosks in airports just to see if they have a historical romance, because I want to like take a picture of it and be like, But, you just mentioned the word impulse purchases, and you kind of also write how that is another way to maybe cheapen the idea of romance, right? And I, as a reader at the end, and if this question has to be taken out or can't be answered, let me know. But at the end of every Avon romance, they say, give in to your impulses. And I don't know, when I see that, and even before I read your book, when I see that, I kind of go like, that's not how I feel about this. So I feel a little weird that they're bringing up that slogan. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
That's really interesting. And you do not have to cut this question. I'm sure it was based on a ton of market research, but I also hear what you're saying. And it's like, we may make that decision quickly, but it's also, I think the decision we made, you and I, is like, we love romance. We love these books. I don't have to decide I love romance and love these books every time I'm going to get one. Like, I know this is for me. I know I'm probably going to like it. So and I don't think it's tremendously impulsive because we know we need a lot of them. So yeah, I think the term impulse is, I think it can be a tricky one for sure. And I don't know that that's entirely how we're all buying them. But yeah,
Cool.
That's really interesting. I'm going to think on this more.
Yeah, it's just something that actually that kind of came to me as I was reading your book, because I've always seen that and I've always thought of that. And I don't know, for me, it's like, oh, of course I have an impulsive, buy now finger on my e-reader, absolutely. Right. But it's impulsive based on, research of my own, because I have researched and read many of these books, or I've read many of these books, which I consider to be research. Right. And so I know that it's going to be something that I enjoy. So
exactly. It looks and sounds and feels like an impulse, but it's actually like you're bringing a lot of experience and prior knowledge to making this purchase decision.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
If the new Tessa Dare pops up, I'm just going to buy it. Right. And it looks impulsive, but I've also spent hours researching whether I like her books or not, So, okay, that's another blog topic. Thank you.
My impulse is I look online and I see multiple authors have produced new books in the last 2 months. And I'm like, how have I not known this? Let's buy this one and this one and this one.
Yay!
I love, though, how the romance community really is so inclusive as a community. I'm not speaking of representation here in this sense. We've already said there's some steps to go in that, but the community seems to be pretty helpful to each other and want to build each other up. It feels like a fairly feminist space, women helping women. And I see that with authors, they promote each other's books.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things that makes romance so powerful is that there is a culture and community of helping in romance. I remember when I first got my book deal, my very first book deal 1,000 million years ago, a big author who I knew it was Eloisa James. I knew her from other spaces. And she said, go join your local Romance Writers of America chapter. And I did, and I joined the national organization. And I wouldn't be where I am if it hadn't been for that, because not only are you find people who share your love of romance where you don't have to justify it. You can just talk about it from a position of love and joy and intelligence. You don't have to explain it to someone. So that's an amazing space that Romanclandia has created, or Romance Writers of America. And then the way they help take a reader and make her into an author and make her into a successful author is astounding. And I don't see that in any other space. I don't think they do that in TV. I don't think they do it in literary fiction. I don't think they do it even in other genre fictions as much as we do. I had a friend go to the NINC Novelist Inc. conference once, and they were like, the people in romance really have their shit together when it comes to talking amongst themselves, not just about our love story, but when you're signing your contract, what should you watch out for? And what are the best marketing tips and tricks that are working right now? And here's what I did to game the Amazon algorithm. Here's how you can do it too. We are constantly sharing amongst ourselves and recommending each other's books, promoting the whole genre as well as ourselves. And I think it's a rising tide that lifts all boats.
And I think that it harkens back to your reasons why romance books are dangerous for girls, right? Which is that because of women, empowering women, getting together, and because women become authory. And, and I just think that's, it's lovely to see, people building each other up. And I actually went to a panel moderated by Tessa Dare a couple weeks ago at a local bookstore. And the story that you said about, Eloisa James telling you to go to RWA, that exact same story was echoed by an author named Kristen Rockaway, I believe, that was on the panel, who said that Tessa Dare had done that for her. So what a cool community.
It's a wonderful place. Have you guys gone to the conference or your local chapter yet?
No, not yet. but we are planning to go to like the big conference next year for sure.
Yeah.
And then I know my friend was in New York this year for the RWA conference, and she was just had a blast. Like she just went as a spectator because she's just also a fellow romance novel enthusiast, and a friend of hers does some reviewing stuff, but she was just like, oh my gosh, I met so-and-so. She's so nice. You know,
it's so cool. You can see your like biggest favorite authors and then approach them, and we're all in the same space. I mean, it's really, really cool. I go almost every year, and I had a habit where like at least once a conference, I would like find myself in a small enclosed space alone with Nora Roberts, like in an elevator in the ladies' room. Like,
that's so funny.
That's so cool that you can have that access from reader to author and vice versa. Like, I'm never going to be alone in an elevator with like, I don't know, Shonda Rhimes or something. Some bigger
Hey, you never know. Hey, it's starting to happen. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
So in our podcast, we have a feminist scale, like how feminist it is. We always try to relate it to feminism, and just talking about with Romanclandia and how, you know, the authors really build each other up and they help each other out within the novels as well as in real life. Like how do you feel romance rates on a feminist scale? Because I think that some women have problems with romance because it's not portrayed as a feminist organization, but look at all these women building each other up and building strong female characters. So for you, what's your feminist gauge on the whole thing?
I think we're on our way to 10, right? Mm-hmm. From 1 to 10. It's little things in a book of like, okay, authors, don't rely on the crazy ex-girlfriend trope. Like, don't rely on the mean girl. Like, give a little more nuance. Don't just immediately throw your sisterhood under the bus, and pay more attention to how you portray every female character in the story, not just your heroine. So on a textual level, we see that happening. But I think what's happening right now is like, okay, we're a feminist genre. We're cool with that. We're doing something that no other media or entertainment space is doing. But like, can we be more intersectional in our feminism? And that is the conversation that's happening now. And that's the next frontier for feminism and romance. And I mean, feminism in the world at large too. And so I think until we reckon more with that, and we can't say we're a completely feminist genre just yet.
Fair. Absolutely fair.
Yeah. And in our last book that we discussed, I think, so we usually say, is it a supporter? Is it neutral? Or is it an offender, rather than for our rating? Cause there's so much nuance, right? But last book I did say, I didn't feel like there was something particularly overtly that someone on the outside would look at and say, that's such a feminist supporter. It's not like the heroine is going around and campaigning for votes for women or something to that kind of effect. But it was just that there were such great, strong relationships between all the female characters in the book. She and her stepmother had a great relationship. She and her sister, who was a lot more beautiful than her, they had such a tight relationship, and they were, super bonded. And the stepmother and the dead mother, like, had this wonderful, like, passionate kind of, I'm taking care of your daughter thing. And so to me, that was like, yes, we're portraying really good female relationships in text. And that is just as important as, votes for women in today's day and age. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more. And when we talk about like strong female characters, like, I think what we really mean is not like a physical strength, but a nuanced portrayal, a depth to the portrayal. And then you're getting that when you see these rich, nuanced relationships. And so much, in the world, we want to talk about like mean girls and women are competitive with each other. And I think it's so revolutionary to show strong relationships, supportive relationships between women. And I think that counts for a lot. A lot.
I 100% agree.
I don't always get that anywhere else. I mean, when only like 20 to 30% of speaking roles in TV and film are women, like, how are they talking to each other? So women talking to women on the page is really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And having those great relationships. It's, it's another thing to model, like to see that that's how we can be with each other rather than seeing each other as the enemy.
Yeah. It is every time I do see it, it's really good because like, I mean, honestly, I'm a very competitive person. I always have been. But at the same time, and I think like, as I've kind of gotten older and feminism's become more important to me, like I want to build up other women. And I wrestle with that internally with just like wanting to win all the time and like be the best, but also be like, but let's bring up everybody around me. And so like the more that we portray that and make that normal, we kind of can shed, I think, that expectation of ourselves a little bit of the like, I have to be at the top, or, when there's only one woman in the room and you're competing for that spot, like, I feel like we have to say, no, there should be 10 women in this room and I'm going to bring 3 with me every time I go.
Exactly. 100% that. And also we need to redefine what winning is. Like, okay, you're the one woman in the room. Are you really winning? Like, is that the prize you want? Like, isn't it better if it's 50-50?
Let me tell you, I at work, I am almost always the one woman in the room and it is not winning. I really would like a whole constituency in there. Like we need more, but anyhow, we've digressed a little bit.
Yeah. No, I don't think we have though, because right when Dangerous Books for Girls came out, I was invited to give a talk at General Electric, did a Women in Leadership Summit. Cool. And so I was speaking about Dangerous Books for Girls to like 250 top level executive women. And they were all like, oh my God, we've never been in a room with this many women before. And I was like, oh, like come to my local chapter. Like, what is every romance conference? So it's very interesting when I realize how special that is in romance, that it is women working with women, still competing with each other for, a slot on a publisher's list or a spot in a reader's TBR pile, but we're still friendly about it. And we're still competing, but we're not harming each other in the process, I think.
You're competing, but you're not overall. Yeah. You're not dragging someone down for your success.
Right.
There's space.
I want to say, like, I'm aware this is not everyone's experience in Romanclandia or at Romance Writers of America. So I want to just shout out that that's not always the experience, but I think enough people have had this experience that we should keep working to make sure everyone gets it, because it's so powerful and interesting. And once you're like, no, I've been in a room with 300 power player women, like, I'm not going back to being the one lone voice representing. Like, yeah, it doesn't have to be that way.
No, for sure.
So,
yeah. And then segueing back to books.
Yeah, I know, right?
But we want to talk about, people think that romance is unrealistic, but science fiction is not.
You wrote about how throughout the years, people have always been worried that women are going to read romance and they're going to have these unrealistic expectations of what their lives are going to be. But at the same time, people don't look at science fiction or fantasy genre in the same way. And so what's up with that?
So saying a romance is unrealistic is a way to manage a reader's expectations. And it's basically saying, don't even girl, this is not going to happen for you. This is not real or true. And I was astounded in my grad school studies coming across people saying this about women's fiction in the 1700s and early 1800s. It goes so far back. And when you look at the novels at the time, what was unrealistic about it then? They were just marrying for love. They were just, being the subject of a story, having interior thoughts of their own, saying words on the page.
What? So, craziness.
It's a craziness. I know. So,
Thinking.
I know. I mean, it's nothing to do with what's actually possible. It's what they don't want to happen is, I think, where the realism and unrealistic claim comes in.
You had a reference in the book too that I just loved. You talk about the Uncanny Valley and how that's, I'll try to do my best of summing up the Uncanny Valley for anybody that doesn't know, but that's like when a robot is like just a little too human and people are, kind of weirded out by it. And so you wrote, but a romance novel, which acrobatically walks a fine line between fantasy and absolutely plausible, realistic, but idealized, is like the robot that is too human. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was just yes, that was a way to explain it to people. Just because it's you think that it can't happen. I don't know. I just thought it was so cool. Such a cool reference.
So it's part of what's happening in a romance, right? Is we have these larger than life characters, and they have these absurd physical descriptions. Her eyes are violet. He's always huge and really built and whatever. They're these idealized specimens, but then what happens is the emotions are so real. The emotional and interior journey these characters go on is so real. And then the actions might be completely unrealistic, ridiculous, probably never happened, would never happen. And it's that juxtaposition. And I'm thinking, all the Dukes, all the highway robberies where they get out just fine, all the Earl who was actually a pirate who came home and
one of my favorites.
All these funny, larger than life, silly even, or just overly dramatic and wonderfully so. You have that juxtaposed with really genuine and authentic and real emotional journeys and interior thoughts. And I think that's where some of the disconnect happens for people, because they see the actions and the outer representation. They're not undergoing that journey with the characters like a reader is. So that's why it feels real to us. Of course she did that because of what we just went through on the last 15 days. So it's an interesting question of how it all works together, the fantasy and the realism of it in a novel. Mm-hmm. And can it work in another medium? I don't know.
Well, yeah, maybe the next 4 years we'll get to see a little bit more of that.
Right. Also, these things become realistic is the other thing. We're writing an image of the world. We're writing a vision of the world that we want to see. Mm-hmm. And once we can all see that on the page and feel what it feels like to be there and to see what we have to go through to get there, you're maybe we can do that. Maybe we can make that real. And that's what makes romance dangerous or powerful.
Yeah. Sorry, world. We want to change you.
Right? But you like it. Trust us.
So then what do you think, you spend a lot of the first part of the book talking about what the history of romance novels and what made them dangerous and how they got their reputation. But what do you actually think that romance novels do for their readers? What's the actual effect that romance novels have?
There's so many ways to answer this. I had a really hard week this week. And at the end of a few really hard days, I was you know what? I need to read a romance novel. And don't get me wrong, I review romance novels for NPR. I write romance novels. I'm reading them. I am constantly reading a romance novel. But the need was overwhelming. And what that overwhelming need was for comfort, for kindness, for not avoiding the hard stuff, but seeing someone who is similar-ish, go through that with grace and joy and find the happy on the other side. And I needed a book that was written in a way that was gonna take me out of my own self and put me into this other place. And then you come out of it and you're I feel better. I think we turn to drinking, right? Sometimes for that feeling, but you just wake up feeling hungover and worse. Whereas a romance is like, I'm going to do that for you and you're going to feel better. I mean, unless you stayed up way too late reading it.
Which I have done on so many occasions.
But I think in a world where they don't want women to get together and talk amongst themselves, they don't want women to talk, they don't want women to think, we don't want to hear what we have to say, we don't want them to put themselves out there, and we make it hard to be a woman, to have this space where you can go where it's okay to be a woman and it's safe and good and you can become recharged. It's tremendously powerful and just nice. Nice is underrated, I think. So yeah, I appreciate romance on a lot of different levels in terms of how it can give this vision of the status quo changing, how it can give women a livelihood, how it can change how we talk about real issues, how it gives us a way to work through really real crap. But at the end of the day, sometimes you're like, it's also just so reliably comforting. And that's so powerful.
I can't agree more.
My week is a lot better talking to you two now.
Oh, well, glad we could lift you up a bit.
Thank you.
We love talking about romance novels. That's why we do it and record it.
And that's why so many people are going to listen and have the conversation themselves.
I met my first male straight romance reader at the historical romance retreat. I went to their book fair, and he and his girlfriend were behind me, and I almost did the stereotype of like, ask her. And then I said, do you both read? And I was like, oh, thank God. I didn't fall into that trap, because he was the one who got her into it. And I was just like, oh my God, hold on to him, keep him forever. Don't let him go. Like, this is amazing.
My husband doesn't even read books.
Oh, no.
He buys them.
Okay. We'll take
and then
money.
He just doesn't get around to that. And that's okay.
I saw on your website, Maya, you have a quote section. And I think that from your husband, he said, her books are the only romance books I'll read. That was a pretty great quote.
He's my first reader for all of my books.
Oh, wow.
And he's really great at it. And he loves talking through them. But I can't get him to read beyond mine. But, one day.
Yeah,
that's okay.
I mean, yeah.
Like, at least read at least watch the movie of Pride and Prejudice. Yeah, I just read the Bromance Book Club. I forget who it's by, but it's about a hero and a group of friends, male friends, who read romance novels.
Oh, that sounds fun.
He uses it to save his marriage, and it's really interesting how she does it.
Cool. Gonna have to put that one on the pile.
Very interesting. I think you guys will have a lot to think about and talk about.
Oh, very cool. So what about the idea that romance is porn for women?
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts around that?
I don't know how to define porn or not porn, but I'm going to say, who cares if it is or it isn't? Humans are interested in sex. Let's look at sex. Let's read about it, look at it, have it, talk about it. I think we go to it in romance because this is one of the only places where, you can get a sex education. You can see sex, the mechanics of sex and the emotions of sex combined. I think you can see from a romance novel how sex is part of a relationship and a character's development. And so it takes this thing we're all super interested in and giggly about, but it's no, let's put it in context. And I don't know what else provides sex in that context besides actually your own relationship, which if that's what you want, I hope you have that.
Education is important, and it's always good to learn more, right? We're always on a quest.
Well, one of the things I learned in my research, and it comes up again and again, is that most people discover romance novels when they're 12, 13. And I think it is a lot of people's first introduction to how sex works.
I read that in your book, and I think I said earlier, like I'm a fairly new romance reader. So Kelsey introduced me to romance books 6 years ago, maybe. I'm almost 32, so mid 20s, right?
Mhm.
And reading this, and Kelsey doesn't, I haven't said this to Kelsey, I don't think ever, but reading this made me realize that actually I did sort of read romance before, and I did find it when I was 12 or 13.
Mhm.
And I sure do wish that I had found romance novels instead. But what I did find was very, very smutty Harry Potter fan fiction.
Yep.
So, and I was funny because I completely had kind of forgotten about it, or, put that in a different storage place in my brain. And not that I mean, some of it I remember thinking was just brilliant literature.
Right. And it might have been.
It very well could have been. I mean, I read some that were like 600 pages.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I would have that free time.
I would stay up late in my room, reading stuff like that.
Sure.
But I think romance novels, like thinking about it now, like if I have kids one day, like, heck yeah, I would hand them a romance novel and I would say, like, let's discuss,
Right.
because I think it is painting such a more complete and kind of a better picture than a lot of other things out there.
Yeah, and it's interesting though because there's plenty of just regular fiction novels that, they have sex scenes in that, but it's to further the relationship, but then to dedicate your book to the relationship where sex is obviously part of the relationship, it's like, oh, let's put that in a different box. Versus I remember my first novels, first fantasy novels, maybe not as detailed, but like they talk about that part of the relationship. They talk about the sex, it goes into that because that's just how relationships evolve. And that's the biggest intimacy you can have with another person. And so it's interesting because even before I read romance novels, I was drawn to books that had a story of two people, whoever those people were, that either fell in love or at least explored a relationship between each other in some sort of manner where sex became a part of it. And it's very interesting because some other novels, what is it? John Green's Looking for Alaska is on like banned books places because he has a scene where there's a blowjob in it, but it's just like, but that's a natural part of like teens exploring life.
Right.
But because we have novels that focus on that relationship and very openly is fine with sex and exploring sex on both the male end and the female end, it's just like, no, it's different. It's not a literary work. It's in its own separate porn box, which I think is just a little silly because there's a lot more to it than that.
Right. And I mean, it's just a human need. So why are we all so squeamish about it?
Well, and it's so like in the popular media now, like you can turn on Netflix as an 8-year-old and probably get passed into your parents' thing or even in the kids' thing, I'm sure. But like, I remember watching a James Bond movie with my like 7-year-old brother, and he was super into James Bond, and like they have some stuff in James Bond movies. And so like I fast forwarded through that part because I was like, I can't sit here with my 7-year-old brother and watch this. Like I feel awkward. And then I went to go get something. I come back, he has rewound it. Like they want to know. They're interested. They're curious. So, it's kind of like,
let's have a good representation then, like to look at. I don't think we're going to turn off the desire or the interest. So like, let's give everybody something good to consider.
Yeah.
And I think that the happily ever after, and I mean, Kelsey and I pretty much stick to historicals. Like that's just what we love.
Yeah.
So
fully support that.
So, it's usually a happily ever after, not a happily for now sort of scenario. But there's so many different happily ever afters that are shown, even within that genre, which is pretty stiff comparatively to maybe a contemporary. And I think that it's not necessarily promoting love at first sight, or it's not necessarily promoting the one. Occasionally you get, the fairy tale kind of idea of that. But Dan Savage, I don't know if you know who he is.
Yeah.
So to anybody else who doesn't, he's a sex advice columnist, and he has a podcast that he's had for many, many years called Savage Love Cast. And I remember one time he said something about, you don't find the one, you find the 0.72 that you round up to the one. And I just was like, I identified with that because I don't feel like life is that perfect, you know? And yes, I want to read about happily ever after, but the bumps along the way make it so much more rich.
Exactly. Well, I mean, the happy ever after is, the after. We want that in the story because it allows us to relax into the bumps and the journey and to really get feel safe to let our guard down and really experience the emotions along with these characters. Because that's what we want. We don't want the perfect from page one. We don't want the happy ever after from page one. We want to go on that journey with the bumps and twists and turns and upsets, but we still want it to work out okay. And because we know it doesn't always in real life, so let's just enjoy it here.
I loved what you wrote too about how that kind of contract between the author and the reader, knowing that there's a happily ever after, it allows us to invest more deeply in the characters. And probably a lot of other people know that fact, but that was the first time I had seen that written down. And I was just like, yes, that's why. I get real stressed out about, certain television shows or movies, and it's just not fun for me. I'm just like, this is not fun for me. But of course I love the ups and the downs. I can't let myself love it if I'm worried.
My mom and I, we will always be like, can you go see this movie for me? Do you know how to end? Is that safe for us to go see? And for exactly that, it's not fun. It's a state of prolonged anxiety. But shortly after I started reading romance novels, I went and read an Alexander Dumas, I don't know how to pronounce it properly, I'm sorry, everyone French, a novel set in the French Revolution. And I was young and naive, and it sounded like a romance. It sounded like a love story. And my first clue it wasn't going to end well was that it was set in the French Revolution and not a mass market paperback. But I read it with my whole heart open because I've been reading romance. And then they fucking died in the end. And I was gutted and devastated. And I couldn't let that happen again, right? No. So if it's a romance, I can't fully invest in it. Yeah. And then what's the experience then?
I'm the worst because I feel that same, with a romance novel, I never feel the need to skip ahead and see what happens. But when I read other novels, especially if it's a physical book, I'll just pick a random page at the end and read a little bit of the end, just be like, okay, so we're still together by this page. Okay, things are still going okay, but 3/4 of the way through this. Okay, so I can get to that point. And but I will say, I know everyone's no, you can't skip ahead. And I was like, no, I need to skip ahead.
You need to.
Because this is a very we're in a very tumultuous time right now, and I'm not sure what's happening. So I need to skip a little bit ahead just to get myself prepared, if this one character is not in it anymore, it's okay, something's going to happen. Be prepared.
Don't fall in love.
Yeah, exactly.
I read 2 very challenging romance novels this last 2 weeks for myself because they were outside of my comfort zone of romance novels. And so I still knew that they were both romance novels. So I felt like there was a happily ever after coming, but one of them was a contemporary, which I would even call a paranormal because it was with a ghost. And I was like, how is this going to end happily ever after? He is a ghost. So I was having a hard time with that. Luckily, it was a very short little novella thing. And they did actually a very clever thing. I liked it. It was happily ever after. And the second one was the first Beverly Jenkins that I've read. And it is, set in Louisiana, kind of right after the emancipation of the slaves and everything. And she really goes into all of the difficulties that were happening. And I had a hard time really getting into those characters because this was the first time I was reading about that. And I was like, are they still going to live happily ever after? Because they're still living in these times, but their happily ever after is that they are together, they're stronger together, and they're fighting this thing together. And so it was hard because the journey there was a little rough for me, but we got there in the end.
Well, this is like, I'm glad you mentioned this, because I think this is one of the most profoundly revolutionary things romance does, is it allows people to have love and joy. And so, and especially when someone when Beverly Jenkins does that with someone, you're like, oh, well, no Black people could like be happy in, the antebellum South or whatever. Like, what she's doing, what any author that writes that story in that time is doing, is so revolutionary. It's saying, we are still human. We're claiming humanity. We're claiming love. We're claiming joy. And like, you can't take that. And that gets really, really to the heart of what romance does. And it's really powerful and important and interesting as a reading experience because you're worried for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The first Beverly Jenkins book I read, I had to keep putting it down, and because I had to mentally, I was like, how are they going to do this? This isn't going to work. I know there's a happily ever after, but how is this going to work? I'm so stressed out right now.
But she takes you there, right? Like, and she does amazing and impeccable research. So, and like,
I learned so much.
You learn so much, and it's not the like dead white guy history that informs a history book, and hers is, she just does different research. It's an extremely great research. And so I think what Beverly Jenkins and any author like her is doing is so, so important and powerful. And that's, I think, what romance does. It's, the happy ending doesn't just make us feel great along the way, but it is like claiming joy for everybody. And that's great.
Yeah.
And, that was actually something that I kind of struggled with doing this podcast was, Kelsey and I both like love Regencies. We love Regency romance, and Regency romance is, like you said, pretty whitewashed. And we're two middle-class white girls talking about, upper class old white people falling in love. So there's nothing wrong with that, but I do feel like it's a bit narrow. So we're still like figuring out how we're going to,
because that's what's available, right?
Yeah.
But there are, Vanessa Riley.
Okay.
People in the Regency. As we start to get those stories in, I think Kat Sebastian writes, gay in the Regency. Scarlett Peckham might be a little earlier, but
I think I've read some of her books too.
Tropes, yeah. So that's maybe not exactly the example for this point, but her books are great. This is the thing, right? I think it's a huge opportunity. So you love the Regency, I love the Regency. We love everything that is, and it has been whitewashed because we're copying off each other. But if we let other people in to tell these stories and bring everything we love about the Regency just more diverse, I think we can all be happy with the books we get.
Yeah.
Who doesn't love a corset and a carriage and all that?
1,000 petticoats.
But I will say though, doing this podcast and looking at these books differently, because all of a sudden we're reading these books not just for pleasure but for discussion, but we're thinking about them differently, and we're thinking about what we're doing differently, and we're kind of reflecting on that over and over and over again. And we're only 8-9 episodes in here, and we're just there's just so much more, and we're already, I feel like both Kelsey, agree or disagree, just talking and thinking differently. I think it's a good journey we're on.
Yeah. It's interesting how, doing this, because even when I sit down to read a book for fun, it takes maybe 1 or 2 books for fun for me to get out of analyzing and thinking. It's okay, I've got a break here. I can read just books for fun. Okay. First book, thinking really hard about it. Okay. Second book. Okay. I'm just having fun here.
I know that feeling.
Because you do a lot of reviewing, so I imagine it's very similar.
Yeah. And some months, I only get to read for the column.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I I love the book. So it's not hard work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great because in reviewing, I start a lot of books I don't finish because if it's not immediately captivating, then I can't review it. And I end up with a lot of books where I'm just like, oh, thank God someone sent this to me. I would have never found it. And I love it so much.
Mm-hmm.
But it's for work.
Yeah.
So I'm still thinking about like, how is she doing how is she doing this? How is she accomplishing what she set out to do with this novel? Like, is there motivation? Whereas if I'm reading just for fun, I'm like, okay. Okay, sure.
Who cares?
Entertain me, whatever.
So I'm curious. I had a situation that kind of reminded me a little bit about a small passage in the book where you talk about how, when you tell people about romance novels at cocktail parties or whatever, usually you get a pretty good response, but occasionally some ignorance as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I got some ignorance the other day. And I was like trying to figure out, how to respond to these. So these kind of moments of, in my situation, I was at work and I was talking about my podcast, which I do. And for the most part, which I've done for, a couple months now, most people are like, oh, cool. they don't have, because I just am like, yeah, we review historical romance novels. Smile,
right.
And they're like, oh, cool.
Right.
But this guy, he'd actually been helping me earlier in the day, and that was really awesome. And we were having a, good conversation. So I didn't feel like this was a situation to kind of belittle him. I didn't feel like he was being an asshole, but he just had this response where, he said, so, we'd been talking about romance novels for a long time now throughout the day, and he had nothing left in his arsenal except the stereotypes, right? So he said, so you read a lot of these romance novels, huh? So your poor husband must be, and I just was like, I think he kind of stopped there.
Good.
And I was just like, my response at that point was, yeah, actually, so we're going to be just talking with an author who has written a whole book about why these novels have this kind of stigma around them. And I find it really fascinating. And so that's how I shut it down at that point. But do you have a go-to for these kind of people who just do have this ignorance? And maybe it's not even like a kind of malicious thing, but it is just an ignorance about what romance novels really mean to people?
Yeah, I think it's an ignorance thing. I think it's still problematic. And it's funny you mentioned this because earlier this year I was at a party and it was like a feminist organization fundraising party. And I was talking to the leader, like the CEO chairman of this organization, to her husband. And he's like, oh, romance novels, the sex books, blah, blah. And I blanked, and all I could think of was like, I've literally written the freaking book on this. And I blanked. And so I was furious with myself, but also like, well, if it can happen to me, it's going to happen to anyone else because you're not prepared for people to be so invasive because it's not about the books. It immediately becomes a personal thing about you and your husband or me and my husband. And I got the research about your sex scenes question. And I was like, it's belittling and it's demeaning and it's like, it's not funny. I would never ask you about, or any stranger about their sex life with their spouse. Like, let's have a drink first. So what I've come away from that is like, we all got to work on our one-liner and memorize it because even I will blank in that situation. But I think they're wrong to say it. I think even if they mean well, it's not okay. So.
Well, and I agree. And I think it is a little bit delicate of me to be constantly talking about my romance novel podcast with my coworkers because, romance and sex.
If you had a sports podcast, would that be weird?
It wouldn't be. And so that's why I don't not talk about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I understand that the question of sex comes up sooner in that kind of a discussion than in a sports discussion, for example. But it doesn't need to.
It doesn't need to.
It doesn't need to. And so that's part of my, I guess, I don't know, not job, but my responsibility to educate them differently to that point. And so that's still what I'm working on.
Good.
But you could think about how many modern problems we're trying to solve because we didn't want to talk about sex and it wasn't brought up.
Right.
And let me tell you, I'm like, everybody can do what they want. Every day I drive by the Planned Parenthood, and in the last few weeks, there's been protesters standing in front of it, and I just want to yell at them so badly. I'm just like, do you want them to stick their nose in your business? No. So just leave. Just leave. It's not your business. Like, your morals, your ethics aside, that's fine. But like, it's not your business. But, you know, I feel like the stigma and the taboo of talking about sex and not talking about it in a positive way and wanting to repress it. This is why there's protesters in front of the Planned Parenthood.
Right. If only they read more romance novels.
Exactly.
More intersectional romance novels. Mm-hmm. I feel like we almost every time we get this should reply with like a lecture and dissertation. And they will not make that quip again. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we need to like confront it head on, but at the same time, like, I'm at a party, it's awkward, like, I don't know you don't know, like, we're not just
this is not the hill I want to die on today.
Yeah.
One day it will be.
Yeah, I hate the caught unawares thing. So I'll be working on my one-liner for sure.
I know. Same. I need to do it too.
So, but speaking also of men and romance and happily ever after, I actually recently, and this kind of comes into play because your newest series of books is in the Gilded Age.
Yeah.
And I saw that the creator of Downton Abbey, Julian Fellowes, is also writing a Gilded Age series.
Yes.
And I recently saw the Downton Abbey movie. Did anybody else here see the Downton Abbey movie?
No, I was talking to my friend about going to see it next Friday, but apparently she's volunteering. Like,
right.
I will just say, Kelsey, if you'd like to see a comedy, please go see it. It is the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. We spent the three of us, my two friends, spent the whole time just dying in laughter because it was so bad. It was cliche. And I was like, this is so written by a man. I mean, it's literally like, okay, so what do women like? They like happily ever after. Okay, so we've got to show that this couple has a kid. So quick, someone walk through the scene carrying the kid. Check. Like, we've got to see, like, they like it when like someone comes up in society. So we're going to have this servant is actually an illegitimate child of this person. And then we're going to have her fall in love with him. And at the end, wait, let's get a sunset. Okay. They can't dance in the ballroom. So, okay, we're going to put them out on the balcony and they're going to dance outside on the balcony. Check. Like, I've read that in a romance novel, which to be fair, I have, but I had the entire like,
written it probably,
but I've had the entire buildup of that tension in a romance novel, which there was absolutely none of in this disaster of a movie. I probably should have said spoilers for Downton Abbey movie at the beginning of this.
Well, that's upsetting because I love the series, but that's always what happens though, because, and this is why I love the romance novels, because you get the whole story versus like anytime they try to put something that could be a wonderful, beautiful story, especially in people's lives, like there's so much nuance. There's so much like things going on. You can't put that in an 1.5 hour movie because it takes me 4 hours to read a book.
Right.
And I feel like the thing that Downton Abbey was so good of was the twists and the turns and the not happily ever after. Yeah. So it was kind of obvious that Julian Fellowes did not know how to write happily ever after.
Or like he was pandering. I haven't seen it, but from what you're describing, it sounds like pandering, had a checklist. And I think this is what happens when like people from outside romance like become aware of romance. And I'm like, oh, I can do that. And it's like, no. Like, we're the authors. We study our craft. We train. We read a lot of books. We read the books our readers are reading, so we know what the expectations are and how to do it. And like the creators are the consumers, and it all works together to get these like nuanced depictions with the build-up, so it doesn't just feel like women love babies, let's put a baby in with the sunset. Like you lose something, I think, when you try to fake it or copy it, or you don't approach it completely authentically.
Yeah.
I was going to be the movie, but now I'm not.
I know. I can just wait now. It's okay. You saved me $15.
I kid you not. So it started off, the women, there was like a group of older women behind us, and they were like, the whole like first 7 minutes, they were so loud, like, oh my God, here's the castle. Oh my God, it's Thomas. Wait, that's not Thomas. That's James or whoever. And they were like, oh wait, no. Oh my God, do you remember what happened? And it was like, we were sitting there like, oh my God, they're going to talk the whole time. They're never going to shut up. And like, then we were the worst. We just laughed so loudly the whole time. And they were so mad at us. They kept like, and I was just like, listen, lady, this is not the movie you deserve.
We've been the people at that viewing thing, but it was because we were expecting a movie like you just said. So we gave ourselves rules and we turned it into a drinking game. And so we were the cackling people because we're like, haha, you have to drink. And someone in the audience is like, you need to be quiet. We're like, whoa, were you expecting this movie to be good? Sorry.
I mean, yeah, I will actually say though that there is a very weird side movie within the movie that would have been brilliant, and it is to do with Thomas going to a gay club, and it's really at that part I was like, I want this movie. But anyhow, before we kind of like wrap up here, Maya, I mean, is there anything else you want to talk about dangerous books for girls?
I think we've covered so much of it.
I found this book to be such like a breath of fresh air, like validating all my thoughts. So thanks for taking the time to like research it all and put it all down and put into words all the things that kind of have been floating around in my head. I just really think everyone should read it. Like, I think it should be required reading.
Thank you so much. I think something happens with when you write any book, but this one I felt in particular. You sit down to write and you're like, am I crazy? Am I crazy? I'm just going to put it out there anyway. And so every time I hear someone say like, it helped them think about romance in a new way or articulate it in a new way or just feel better about something that they love that brings them joy, I feel like, okay, I did my job here. That's good. But, all other creators out there, just you're going to feel crazy and do it anyway.
Great advice.
Super. Yes. And can you let our listeners know what you're up to right now and where they can follow you so they can discover what you're up to next?
Yes. Next on my to-do list is copy edits. Always a fun time. My next book is the third book in my Gilded Age Girls Club series. It's called An Heiress to Remember, and it is dueling department stores.
Into it.
To lovers, second chance at love. It's fun. So that will be coming out March 2020, April 2020. But you can visit my website, mayarodale.com, sign up for my newsletter on my website, or follow me on all of the socials as Maya Rodale, and I will make sure you do not forget about An Heiress to Remember.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And I wanted to say too that we've actually mentioned you and your books. Well, we've mentioned your books on our podcast before, but we did not credit you. So I'm so sorry. But we mentioned a while ago when we were talking about kind of catchy, clever titles and stuff. We mentioned your Keeping Up with the Cavendishes series.
Oh, that was fun.
Which loved, by the way. I loved those books. I gobbled them up.
Cheers.
I came up with the title of Lady Bridget's Diary as like a joke, and my editor was like, yes.
Yes.
Like, okay, so we're doing this.
Yes, that. And I actually from reading on your website realized your Wallflowers series you did as also contemporaries. Is that the deal? It's like basically the same-ish book, but as a contemporary?
Yeah, the premise is that the heroine of the contemporary is writing the historical. So the beats are roughly the same, or like you'll see what happens in her life. You can't see me quoting. What happens in the contemporary stories and how it reappears or is worked through in a historical way. I believe we read and write historical romance because we want to understand ourselves right now. And it's a way of doing that. So this was a fun, labor-intensive way to do that.
Wow, that's fascinating. And maybe I'll pick up a contemporary soon.
Yeah. Do you know what? They're so quick and easy, and you'll fly through them.
Well, I love your Wallflowers also. So then it's like also part of kind of reliving that. So really, really fun and exciting. So anything else that you'd like to add, Maya?
No, just thank you so much for an interesting conversation and for sharing the love about dangerous books for girls. And I am so excited for you guys to read more romance and talk more romance. And you're going to have the best time.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. This was so fun and so cool. And we were just truly so jazzed that you were up for this. And we just are, thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation.
All righty.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. All right. Have a good weekend, you guys.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Wow, Kelsey. So our first interview is in the books, and I had such a fun time talking with Maya. I don't know about you.
Oh, I did too. I really liked her insights, and I felt almost a little like, I was like, wow, look at this person who just knows what she's talking about. How amazing is that?
Yeah, it's really cool. And it also just makes me want to be better at talking about it all. And I know that's what we do here on this podcast is we talk about romance novels, but everything she wrote in that book, I said it in the interview, but I really believe like we as romance readers should go read that book. We should have our kind of one-liner queued up, ready to go. And it, like we kind of mentioned throughout the interview, like it doesn't have to be antagonistic. We don't have to bring people down, but we can educate them.
Absolutely. And I think that really every point she brought up, even from the beginning of the book, it's funny because she talks about things that you probably never thought about. But then once you get into it, you're like, oh my gosh, you're right. She's right. This is so true. And it's just really fantastic the way she puts it. And she does it in a really eloquent and educated manner. Like it really reads as an educated person talking about it, which I think is the most unique take on it. But speaking to her, she just had such great things to say about Romanclandia as a whole, fellow authors, even publishers, really lifting up the genre and being like, it shouldn't be a secret thing we hide in the dark. It should be 100% lifted up because it's really doing great things for women.
Yeah, she has a section at the end of the book, which is why does it matter how we talk about romance novels? And I'm going to read a few little excerpts here because I think it sums it up perfectly. And because she has done it so beautifully, there's no reason to say it any other way. So the book reads, romance novels feature nuanced portrayals of female characters having adventures, making choices, and accepting themselves just as they are. When we say these stories are silly and unrealistic, we are telling young girls not to expect to be the heroines in their own real lives. Romance shows a variety of heroines, be they plain, pretty, plump, or skinny. They might be black, white, rich, poor, gay, or straight. But when we say only stupid women read these books, we are telling young girls that they're foolish for believing that they can be beautiful and lovable just the way they are. So there's so much more within her book, and really there's so many great sections we didn't even get into, and so many statistics that are going to blow your mind if you open up the pages. So I really, really recommend everybody, if you're a romance reader, get your hands on this book. Just use it as a reference and a resource. And I think it's really validating to realize that this is important and someone has looked at it in this light. So anyhow.
Absolutely. And she has so many footnotes. And for me personally, I'm like, I want to read those books you used to quote in your book because those sound interesting too.
Oh my gosh, definitely. I was actually checking the footnotes. I don't usually like go back and check footnotes of a book, but I was like, where's this from? That's so cool. So I was super into it. And so you can find out more about Dangerous Books for Girls at dangerousbooksforgirls.com. And also on that website, you're going to find all of those infographics that I was talking about in the beginning with statistics on romance readership, opinions of romance readers. I even know that one of our listeners mentioned to me that she was one of the participants in one of the studies that Maya did back before releasing this book. So that's kind of cool. Romanclandia, everybody is so connected. I love it. And you can also get all of her other books and find out more about her at mayarodale.com. And like she said, follow her on social media at Maya Rodale. She's always posting really cool facts about awesome women from history. So there's a lot going on and you should give her a follow.
And if you haven't picked up one of her books, we highly recommend them. We've mentioned a few of them in the past, but also she has her third book in her Gilded Age series coming out next spring sometime. So you should definitely read 1 and 2 before number 3 hits the shelves.
I know that I am going to do just that. I'm very excited to maybe take a trip away from Regency England for a little while and get into Gilded Age New York. It sounds fabulous.
Absolutely. Get all that new money in there.
So if you'd like to get in touch with us, if you have some follow-up or thoughts or questions about what you heard today, our email is romancepod@gmail.com.
And you can find us on social media at Tea and Strumpets. So T is in Tom, N is in Nancy, Strumpets. And that's on Instagram and Twitter.
And Facebook.
And Facebook. There you go. We're on everything.
We're everywhere. And finally,
you can check us out in a week with our Halloween episode. It's out on actual Halloween, and that'll be the Viscount and the Vixen.
Ooh, spooky.
By Lorraine Heath, which is really funny because I just literally read like Lorraine Heath all my vacation.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. This one's got a spooky setting in the moors, and it's got a ghost that wanders the castle, but it's still kind of within our wheelhouse here. I didn't want to get too paranormal, but it is the spoopy season, so we had to do something a little bit in that vein. And I love Lorraine Heath too. I'm excited to read this one. So join us on October 31st as we read The Viscount and the Vixen by Lorraine Heath.
And may all your ever afters end happily.
Tea and Strumpets is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Find more podcasts you'll love at frolic.media/podcasts.
Also just want to talk about in books, because with romance, they, people portray it as unrealistic.
You froze.
Those relationships aren't.
Kelsey, you froze.
Hold on. I got to get my charger too.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Am I unfrozen now?
You are unfrozen.
Okay, cool. Perfect. We'll just take a minute. I'm going to take a sip of this water. It's going to be great.
Yeah. Do some stretches.
Yes.
The dog stopped growling, so that's good.
I can see her behind you. That's that black blob, right? That's Daisy?
Yep, that's the black blob. That's Daisy.
She's so much better. If Thea was in the room with me, she would be jumping on this window and looking, and yeah, she's 1.5 years, so she.
Okay.
But
my dog is older and wiser, and she just like still lay down, but she likes to be in the same room as me, so like she has to be in the room, because if I don't have her in the room, then she's gonna be like, why am I not in the room?
Yeah.
Me too.
Okay, and then I'll edit that as an actual sign off.
Yeah, I got to think about that. I was like, what am I saying?
Yeah.
All right, have a good day, guys.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much.